Okay, in this video I'm going to quickly move through the information from Chapter 2, hit the high points, and so let's go ahead and move through that. So with this we're going to take a look at a brief history of the International Monetary System. We'll look at some current exchange rate arrangements, which is kind of the bulk of this chapter, the important stuff in this particular chapter, and then just quickly talk about the European Monetary Union and the EU, the European Union. So let's move into a brief history of the International Monetary System. There have been basically 5 main regimes. We're going to just very quickly go through these. The book talks about them in more detail. I'm not necessarily interested in this. I won't be asking any questions on this, so let's just move very quickly through there. The first stage, or the first regime, is bimetallism. This was pre-1875. Bimetallism just means 2 metals. The 2 metals were gold and silver, and those were the material used in currency and coins, and that was the money. The exchange rates determined by the gold and silver content in a particular coin, or in coins, and also the value of gold in relation to silver. The second regime was the classical gold standard. It lasted towards the end of the 19th century up until World War I. And this was where paper money was fully redeemable for gold. There was typically a fixed, stable exchange rate for gold at about $35 an ounce. That was prevalent in the U.S. for some time. And the big problem was with the gold standard, if the gold supply grew slower than the world economy, then prices were forced to go down, which is deflation, and that creates very kind of difficult circumstances to operate economies in. If there's the expectation that prices are going to be lower tomorrow, I'm not really likely to buy things today, and that can lead to recessionary type environments. The next regime is the interwar period. So between World War I and World War II, we have this 30-year period. Because the shipment of gold was kind of dangerous, we have that shipment of gold being suspended, and the adjustment mechanisms weren't working because rules weren't being followed, and so we have this kind of weird, strange period there. The Bretton Woods system is a post-World War II creation of the International Monetary Fund. And this had rules for conduct for international monetary policy. There was some assistance for less developed countries. The World Bank was created, and that's its purpose was to facilitate economic development and post-war recovery around the globe. The main thing was a desire to get a stable environment so free trade could happen and it could flourish. And they wanted to help avoid currency manipulation for nationalistic goals. And then finally, the 5th regime, flexible exchange rates. That's kind of the place we find ourselves in today. The market determines these rates. Central bank intervention is allowed but not necessarily encouraged, and gold has been officially abandoned as a reserve asset. So let's move on to different regimes. The book mentions 10 different exchange rate arrangements that are used around the world today. We're going to focus on the 4 most prevalent, and in no particular order. We're going to start with no separate legal tender. This is where a country will use a different country's currency as their own. So an example would be to adopt the dollar, someone that's not the U.S. adopting the U.S. dollar. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could help prevent hyperinflation or impose some discipline on a national government that hasn't really shown itself to be trustworthy with the printing press for currency. So some examples here are Ecuador, El Salvador, and Zimbabwe have all in the past adopted the US dollar. I believe Zimbabwe got rid of the US dollar as their currency not too long ago. Kosovo, Monaco, San Marino all use the euro, even though they're not in the European Union. The second regime here is the currency board. This is where the currency is legally tied to a different currency at a fixed exchange rate. So the difference here is that, for instance, Hong Kong would have their own Hong Kong currency, a Hong Kong dollar, but it's going to be tied to the US dollar in this case. So that would be an example of a currency board. The currency board in Hong Kong moves or intervenes in the market such that the exchange rate to the US dollar is going to be relatively fixed, around $7.85 Hong Kong to 1 US dollar. The next regime is the free-floating regime. This is where currency is allowed to change based on market conditions, that is, supply and demand for the currency, and intervention is only going to happen in extraordinary circumstances. So the examples of this are going to be the big currencies around the world, the euro, the US dollar, the Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, the UK pound, Mexican peso, the Japanese yen are all examples of free-floating currency. And then lastly is this crawling peg, or a crawl-like arrangement. This is where the currency is adjusted by a central bank in very small increments, and they're trying to, the central bank is trying to keep the currency within some bands, so within a kind of a low point and a high point. And China is kind of the preeminent example of this. They want to have their currency kind of narrowly move around within a certain range. Every once in a while they change that range, but they're not going to let the market dictate it. They will kind of let the markets play within some certain boundaries. So let's move on to the next slide here, the European Monetary Union and the European Union and the euro. So the euro is the second most used currency in the world. There's a list of original countries that were part of the euro currency. There's probably about 13 of them here. I don't really, I'm not going to ask you any of these questions, so you can take a look at the book and see those countries. There have been newer additions since 1999. Greece, Slovenia, Cyprus, Malta, Slovakia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all joined. There were kind of promises made in order to join the EU. Greece kind of famously hasn't really lived up to those, and that's caused a number of problems within the EU. There are countries in the queue, countries waiting to get into the EU, and they're kind of needing to meet certain conditions to get in. Some examples of countries in that queue are Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Sweden. The European Central Bank is out of Brussels. They're the ones that kind of control the monetary policy for this currency union. And then we have some costs and benefits of the EU. Some benefits, kind of the big ones are reduced transaction costs, the elimination of exchange rate uncertainty and risk across this union, and it also gives more price transparency and encourages competition among the members. And lastly, it creates a very large capital market, so very deep, and it's the second most used currency, so that kind of helps facilitate things. Some costs of this union are the loss of national policy independence, so some sovereignty issues that we talked about in Chapter 1. It's very difficult to deal with something called asymmetric shocks. That is something that hurts one country in the EU but not another one. So it's very difficult to deal with problems at the euro level when it's a common currency across all countries. So for instance, if Italy had an issue that was particular to Italy, they really can't manipulate their currency because their currency is shared by a dozen other countries. And then the last part of the chapter deals with currency crises, and we're not going to get into any depth there. Again, if you have some interest there, I'd encourage you to take a look at those. Read through the Mexican peso crisis, the Asian currency crisis, the Argentinian peso crisis, but there's not going to be any material on exams or quizzes that are covered there. So that is, in a nutshell, Chapter 2. Clearly, it's not going to be a huge part of the first exam. The main thing that I will be asking from this chapter are going to be about the current exchange rate arrangements, this slide right here. So know these main four and some example countries in each of them, and you'll be all set. So I will see you next time with Chapter 3.